Hello, hello. Hi there.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to our astrology festival. Today, we have the honor of having Jessica Murray with us, who is a very experienced astrologer and who has worked specifically with transpersonal readings over the years. Thank you very much, Jessica, for joining us today.
Thank you, Anna.
So, we would love to know how your journey with astrology started and what was it that got you into it?
I studied psychology in university. I was interested in, as many of us are who are drawn to psychology, I thought that I would be learning about the mysteries of the human mind. Unfortunately, mostly what I got was little rats in a maze because where I was studying was the emphasis was on experimental, empirical data collecting. But I did get an introduction to Jung, Carl Jung, and then I started working with a theater group who who looked at the psychology from Jungian point of view, and it expanded into the universal, into really what I would call the dark mysteries, which is that there are meaningful archetypes that are universal to everyone. And of course, he used astrology. So it opened the door for me to start studying people like Dane Rudhyar and the great thinkers who looked at astrology from a spiritual point of view.
Mm-hmm. And how would you say that your view of astrology and your practice has changed through the years that you've worked with it?
Well, I started learning the way most astrologers do, which is trying to get a grasp of the basic symbols. Yes. You really have to spend a long time doing that. Read as much as you can about what each symbol means, signs, houses, different house systems, and get a sense for it. You get a feel for it the more you read. You get a feel for it. And then I started to, move away using the foundation of the sort of having learned the alphabet. Then you move into how to use the alphabet the way a language speaker would, who has to master the alphabet first and then learns how to use words and then use sentences and finally maybe even move into poetry. I mean, that's really what we're dealing with here is a cosmic alphabet. And I do think that I used some of my psychology training in there too. All of us do, whether we're educated explicitly in it or not. When we sit with clients, you get a feel for what would really help them. One thing that wouldn't help them, for example, is to talk about the stereotypical things that are associated with the different things in the chart. It doesn't help anybody to repeat the negative connotations, for example, of a square or a Saturn aspect. They already know that anyway. So you want to sort of lead them into what their expertise is rather than what their pitfalls are. Unless you're working with them regularly. I think that many of your listeners probably do have regular clients where it becomes kind of an astrotherapy session and you meet them weekly or monthly. And then I think you can get into more of the shadow side of their chart and help them work with it.
Right. So, what is your typical approach when you work with clients? How do you approach reading and interpreting their birth chart?
Well, these days I mostly work with people who are interested in the soul path dimension rather than sort of a delineation of their character traits. They can get that from the internet. You know, these days, you don't even need a beginning astrologer reading to give you that. But of course, it's patchwork. And what people want when they go to a professional astrologer is a holistic picture of how all these different things that they may have read one by one about, how they all work together. And that takes time. But once you do get a feel for that, as I say, I tend to attract the type of client these days who wants to go beyond just the personality. That's why it's called transpersonal, into a sense of why the soul decided to have this configuration. Why, you know, we could call it the higher self, if you like, had some kind of a plan that they would live out of this particular skill set, which resulted in them being born, if you will, at a certain place at a certain time to have that particular map. Right. And I think that we can look at it on various levels. There is the level of personality traits that it's a perfectly fine chart interpretation a reading can have. And maybe you start with that. Sometimes I start with that with people who are less familiar with astrology. You want to hook them into, I see who you are on that level. And then I try to move beyond it into the second level of reading. Within the 55 minutes, it's not easy, as we know, but you could try to secondly get into the psychological underpinning of why. You know, for example, Capricorn is stereotypically supposed to be so reliable and looks older than their years, and upright and responsible. The second level of reading that says, why is that so? What are the psychological underpinnings to those traits? And the answer is a little deeper. It has to do with structuring, that their specialty is to build structure in themselves and others. And you mentioned that Capricorn governs the spine. You know, you could bring into it different analogies and metaphors to see that it isn't just a personality map. And then I think the big one is, for me, the third level, which is more abstract, and I'm going to call it transpersonal. And on that level, you talk about energy. You talk about, for example, what is the essence of Capricorn? Where does it fit in the cycle of 12? Why is it after Sagittarius and before Aquarius? And what does it mean that it's cardinal and that it's earth? And you try to get them thinking more in terms of the energetics. So, you know, you leave them hopefully with a more imaginative sense of this energy that's running through them.
Totally. Well, thank you. That's very, very interesting.
Mm-hmm.
While browsing a little bit through your work, I saw that you often emphasize wanting the people you help, helping them see the bigger picture. Why do you feel it is so important to do so?
Could you explain what you mean in this context by the bigger picture? And speak up just a little bit, if you would.
Of course. So what I mean is that specifically when I was looking into how you help your clients, what is it that you do? I saw that you mentioned starting, you know, from a personal point of view and maybe going to a more general reading, referring to the collective. And
yes,
people see
right.
the picture. Could you explain to us what that is
about? So, you know, I have a moon in Sagittarius in the 9th house. So I feel at home in that way of looking at life anyway. But it is always true, I think we would agree, that certain clients come to you for a reason, that there's a mirroring going on, as above, so below. as within, so without. So we tend to draw to us clients who consciously or unconsciously want that point of view. So I often get the type of person who wants to hear how they fit in to the collective. Technically, what that means is that the outer planets immediately identify us as a member of a certain subgeneration, and then generation, and then era, right? And then epoch.
Yeah.
So when we think about the Pluto and Leo generation, for example, we already have an immediate sense, although very general, very, very abstract, not character trait driven, but we have a very rough sense of that their soul wanted to come in, you know, when the 60s were roaring into that self-expressive Leo mood, and that all kinds of societal mores were being shattered, and you have a sense already, very general. It's not something that you would be able necessarily to articulate to the person at first glance, but you personally as a practitioner start to get a sense of how they fit into the big picture of their era. Then you move into the societal planets, for example, Jupiter and Saturn. And you do all this in a split second. You know, you don't necessarily verbalize any of this, but you go, oh, and they're part of the Saturn and Virgo generation too, within that Pluto and Leo. So they have a certain kind of 2.5 year imprint. That's the group karma for their little subgeneration. And within that, they are meant to be the ones who specialize in da-da-da-da, you know, in this case, Saturn and Virgo, that probably a heavy emphasis on health and new healing tricks, and maybe fixated on nutrition. I'm thinking of my own generation here.
Right.
And then you go into the personality stuff, which I consider the inner planets, to remind them that they have a very unique, individuated take on what their generation's mandate is. So there's these layers. And the big picture is, the biggest picture of all, is that they decided to incarnate in the first place. So, you know, this gets into that spiritual or the cosmic underpinning of this art that we practice, which presupposes that the world needed us. The world needed that particular set of skills and talents and insights. Potentially, it's all potential. We have no idea what the client's going to do with it, whether they're going to live up to any one part of it, but on a potential level, we presume, don't we, that the cosmos needed that. So it needed a soul to come in who personified all those very particular specialties. And if you can convey that, I think you're giving them the biggest picture of all.
Totally. Thank you very much for your answer. Since you mentioned, you know, Pluto and how Pluto and Leo, you know, formed a generation, I was meaning to ask you about this upcoming Pluto in Aquarius, you know, season. How do you think that will affect us? What are some changes we might be seeing soon?
Yeah, big one. So I have a webinar on Pluto and Aquarius that you could get from my website, mothersky.com, which is, you know, 90 minutes of talking about this one thing, but all astrologers, as you know, are hopped up about it. Yeah. There's going to be a interesting podcast called The Rage of Aquarius that I'm also going to be talking on coming up next week. You know, we're really straddling the line of the famous age of Aquarius that was heralded before a couple generations ago. And maybe you could call it one generation ago. But when I was young, the musical Hair and the hippies coming out and the summer of love made famous this idea that there was a new age coming. And I don't know if your audience is familiar with the negative connotations of that phrase, new age, but of course in English it's gotten very corny sounding. And people are skeptical about it. It seems very old and hackneyed now, but at the time it was brand new. The idea of a new age was a hot new idea. And as the lyrics of that famous song point out, it was this concept of there being a whole new 2,000-year segment of time what the human species was moving into. People started to get hip to astrology. They started to recognize that there was this 26,000-year cycle, which we call the Great Year, and that we were moving from the age of Pisces into the age of Aquarius and crossing this major threshold. Now, we've had several transits lately in current times, which make that threshold crossing reverberate. One of them was the Jupiter-Saturn conjunction that happened a couple of years ago. The late in the 2020, when COVID was raging, but that was in Aquarius, first degree. And now we have Pluto going into Aquarius, which is another echo. Could call it a cosmic echo. Like that string, if you think of aspects as being guitar strings, it gets plucked and the sound vibrates, it reverberates, so that every time a more quickly moving transit touches that same string, you hear that chord again. So these various, some of them are more fleeting transits, like the Jupiter-Saturn conjunction, although it begins a big cycle. And now Pluto going into Aquarius, which is about 20-year cycle. They're all raising the imagery and intensity of the whole age of Aquarius, which is a 2,000-year cycle. And you wonder what the specifics are. They're pretty obvious. Aquarius governs technology. And we expect in the next 20 years that human beings are going to have to come to grips with AI and what robotics and all the other advanced technologies that have been happening so fast that the human mind, not to mention its morality, has not had a chance to catch up with. This is going to have to be done in the next 20 years. Pluto in Aquarius, I believe, is also going to raise the specter of overpopulation, because Aquarius is the sign of the human species. It's the only sign in the zodiac that specifically denotes Homo sapiens. It's about humans in groups. And so overpopulation is one of the maybe it's one of the four horsemen of the apocalypse, but it's obviously a critical issue that a lot of people haven't talked about because we've been busy doing other things. But with Pluto and Aquarius, I think it will burst out of its hidden zone and become a major talking point. Also space, Aquarius governs the boundaries of its fixed air. So you get the idea of a pursuit up into the airy zones, and that means space, the next frontier. I could go on, but you've probably thought of these things too when you think of Aquarius: flight, science, the mind.
Yes, well, thank you. Since you mentioned, technology and the impact it could have, I'd like to know your perspective on it, as in, how do you think specifically our knowledge of astrology and the way we practice astrology could change with the rapid evolution of technology?
Well, this is a tricky question because, in a way, astrology itself is a technology. It's an alphabet that has a scientific rigor to it, like math. After all, it's based on geometry, pure numbers. So what it has, if we allow it to happen, is an aspect of soul, which pure cognitive science does not have. That is, Newtonian physics is mechanistic, and the kind of what is conventionally thought of as the scientific mind is strictly based on a mechanistic materialism, which is that physical things are the most real things in the world, and even emotions are probably caused by some neurological release of something in the brain, and the brain is the most important organ, and everything is separate. Well, that's a kind of a separation consciousness that is the basic underlying assumption of what we might call scientism, which is the way that most of us were brought up in the current era to see the world. Material reality is the most real thing. Everything else, emotions and spiritual impulses, are less real, if they exist at all. So when technology, these enormous advances that the age of Aquarius is accelerating and pushing forward into taboo areas like genomics and, changing the cellular nature of little babies who are going to be born, and AI that mimics human life. And when scientists are limited by the kind of mechanistic materialism that we were just talking about, they're going to go into this area without the understanding of the holism of life that astrology does have, or should have. I don't know how you can practice astrology without it. Right. So this is, I think, a real danger. And the ecologists know it. The pioneers know it. The people who study climate change know it. They know that everything is connected. Yes. They know from a scientific point of view, in other words, that everything is connected. And even the quantum physicists know it. They understand the principle of relativity. They go down way into quarks and all these subatomic particles, and they extrapolate from that everything is related and everything affects everything else. Well, that's what I really mean by soul, that everything affects everything else and is inextricably connected. Astrology has a scientific view that already knows that. Right. So I think we need to be at the table. In other words, that perspective needs to inform these technological advances if we're not to destroy ourselves.
Right. So you feel that it is important that while, technological advances happen, we don't forget about the whole picture, the soul part of ourselves and the collective in general.
Yes, I mean, there's a culture lag, isn't there, between the machines and the people who invent them speeding along, racing towards the future, between that and any sense of the consequences and the moral reasoning behind these advances. You don't have to be an astrologer to realize that there's a huge gap there. And that is going to have to be closed so that there's a balance between heart and mind. Right. If we're not to get into real extinction.
Oh, well, thank you for your answers. So you mentioned that you studied psychology, and that impacted you in your work. I would love to know how you think it impacted you. Like, did it change the way you interact, or did it mostly change the way you think about things that you learn and see?
I think it's depends on the kind of psychology, doesn't it? I mean, I was giving you an example of a kind which is very detached and removed when I was in university studying little rats in mazes. But there's also the kind of psychology that's infused with this interconnectedness, which I would call spiritual, right, which Carl Jung innovated. So it depends, but I think that what it does is show you how to relate to people. It gives you a sense of the mystery of the human mind, which is what it's supposed to do. It's supposed to give you a sense of incredible complexity going on under the surface of people. And the chart does that. Granted, we only study, most of us, 10 planets, maybe one centaur, and only a few major aspects. And you can't really do more than that in a given reading. It's limited by time. But that's only the tip of the iceberg. And so if you have an understanding of psychology that translates into the way you approach a chart, you carry with you and you try to convey to the client the enormous complexity that's going on there. And the things you say in a given reading are just scratching the surface. If you can convey to them that they're a unique amalgam of all these astoundingly intricate little moving parts, then you've given them something to work with.
Definitely, I see what you mean. So you think that astrology gave you, a way to deepen your understanding of the mind, even though it's still a mystery, it might be impossible to know all about it, but it made you closer to it a little bit.
Yes, I think so. I think there was a progression, as you suggest, that whatever made me interested enough to take psychology classes in school and find that they didn't have the juice, they didn't go far enough, then led me kind of inexorably to astrology, which went into this idea that there's a mysterious presence behind all the clockwork, all the moving parts. And then, of course, you get into the issue of consciousness. And that's the one thing that the chart alone does not tell you. It doesn't tell you how aware the person is of their potential. And I think that's very humbling to keep in mind. That's something that we can't tell unless we get it intuitively. We're sitting with a person and we can pick up how aware they are of da-da-da-da. But the chart itself doesn't say that.
I see that. So in the end, astrology is a science. It has a very strong scientific component, but it is also, depending on the astrologer's talent and inclination, it is their job maybe to intuitively see what their client needs in that moment, and
that's
how
right.
their potential could be, taken advantage of by them.
Right. Taken advantage of. Right. Exactly. I'm going to have to say goodbye now. Are there parting comments that you'd like to make?
No, I wanted to ask you if there was anything you'd like to add.
I think we've covered a lot in this talk. I just maybe I would close by reminding your listeners that the most important thing is to make the client walk away feeling empowered and unique. That they aren't just the cliches that they read about for their sun sign and moon sign. Right. And if you can convey that, you've done a lot.
Well, thank you very much. I think that is a perfect way to conclude.
Thank you very much, Anna. Take care.
You too.